Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar on challenges to Japan's leadership in Asia and the world, organized by the Center for Geopolitics here at Polis at the University of Cambridge. My name is John Nilsson Wright. I'm a senior lecturer in Japanese politics and international relations at the partner faculty at Cambridge, the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm also senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at Chatham House. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you wherever you may be, whichever part of the world, to our discussion today on a very important topic. Let me start, however, just with a few practical details. I'm sure by now you're all familiar with the constraints of Zoom. Just to let you know that this is being recorded. Other than the speakers and myself, your videos and audio functions are all turned off and will remain off for the duration of our discussion. We're going to start with a few brief presentations by our speakers, followed by then some interaction, and very swiftly after that, Q&A. But I would encourage you, if you do have questions, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And in asking a question, could you indicate both your name and affiliation when you type in your question? And particularly if you have a question that's directed at one of our three speakers, if you could indicate to whom you would like your question to be directed. And initially, at least, if you could limit yourself to one question. I will endeavor to ensure that everybody is heard, but obviously with a webinar, we often have a large audience, sometimes as many as 100, and therefore it may not be possible for me to guarantee that everyone's question will be answered, but I will certainly do my best. Also to let you know that our discussion is on the record, and so everything is officially public, and the proceedings today will be posted on the Polis Geopolitics Center website. So on with our proceedings. Just a few words, I think, of introduction of the topic, the question of Japan's leadership in Asia and the world. As you're all aware, Prime Minister Abe's unexpected resignation in August, prompted by ill health, opened the question of what would happen in terms of his successor. His replacement, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, is perhaps more well known as a domestic, somewhat backroom political tactician rather than an accomplished foreign policy actor, although Mr. Suga has been very keen to push back against that designation, citing the fact that he does in fact have considerable foreign policy experience, but perhaps not a foreign policy profile. So the question I'm sure we're going to be asking is, what direction will he take Japan in the immediate future, particularly since the last 8 years have been very much dominated by the impact and also now the legacy of Prime Minister Abe. So what will Mr. Suga do, and what will the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, do in terms of charting its future, both at home and abroad? At a time, of course, of major international challenges, a rising China, the perennial existential challenge of a nuclear North Korea, and then, of course, most obviously, the global COVID-19 pandemic. With recent developments, of course, in the United States, we now have an election behind us, but no designated official winner, judging from the comments of President Trump, although President-elect Biden, we expect, will take over in January, barring any unexpected outcomes. What will a Biden presidency mean for the relationship with Japan? We've heard a lot of talk that President-elect Biden will focus on alliance relations and move away from the more transactional, unilateral approach of President Trump. There will be a lot of practical questions to consider. The future of the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. Will the United States rejoin this, and what impact will that have on relations with Japan and other countries in Asia? How will Japan build on its new EU-Japan trade partnership? Its new bilateral trade agreement, for example, with the United Kingdom. What role will climate change play, given that Japan has announced, and Prime Minister Suga has announced, that he is pledging a commitment for Japan to be carbon neutral by 2050? What will be the future of multilateral institutions and Japan's role within that? We've heard talk of, for example, of an expanded G7 to include countries such as South Korea. What will be the future of the World Trade Organization, and how will Japan play a role within that body? And then strategically, the future of the free and open Indo-Pacific, a concept, of course, that former Prime Minister Abe was very closely associated with as an innovative initiative that he himself put much of his political capital behind. And then more specifically, with talk of a new, more muscular quad, a quadrilateral partnership between the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. What will that mean in terms of defense cooperation? And lastly, the elephant in the room, the question of China. How will Japan navigate between the two most important countries in terms of global politics, the United States, its traditional ally, and China, its economic partner, with which Japan has, of course, very close ties, but also very clear security concerns. And that last and finally, perhaps if we have time, the question of the balance between domestic policy and foreign policy. Will Prime Minister Suga, given his commitment to immigration reform, be the man who begins to open up Japan in a way that perhaps will be different from previous prime ministers? To discuss these and other issues, we have three very distinguished panelists, all of whom I'd like to point out have authored books this year, beginning with Tobias Harris, who I'm sure many of you will know as the author of The Iconoclast, a new and very timely biography of Shinzo Abe and the New Japan. Tobias is a leading expert on Japanese politics and senior vice president of Teneo Intelligence, a consultancy based just outside Washington, DC. Secondly, Dr. Saori Katada, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California, and author of Japan's New Regional Reality, Geoeconomic Strategy in the Asia-Pacific, published by Columbia University Press this year. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Misha Oslin, Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Dr. Oslin joins us from Washington, DC, and he is also the author of Asia's New Geopolitics, Essays on Reshaping the Indo-Pacific. So three extremely well-informed and very expert authors and commentators on contemporary politics and specifically on the issue of Japan. Let me turn the floor over to them, and beginning with Tobias, to invite him to speak for about 5 minutes. Tobias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that kind and really thorough introduction, which I think shows that we might struggle to cover everything in just an hour. Of course, it's great to be back at Cambridge virtually. I'm a graduate of the, I guess, former Center for International Studies about 15 years ago now. So I wish I was visiting in person, but this is better than nothing. So thank you for that. I just want to speak briefly about, so as John said, I've recently published what turned out to be an exquisitely timed biography. It came out in the UK and elsewhere the day before Prime Minister Abe announced his resignation. And of course, one of my goals in writing this book was looking at his legacy at a point where, I mean, whether or not he resigned, we had a pretty good sense of what he had accomplished and what he might be remembered for after leaving office. And just for the purposes of our discussion today, I just want to focus on what I think really is the main takeaway when we think about Japan playing a leadership role in Asia. And that is, I think, the most effective thing that Abe did over the course of 8 years was he turned domestic political stability into a tremendous international asset. And what you had basically, Abe takes over course after a period where you had a revolving door premiership. You had 6 prime ministers in as many years, starting with Abe's first star-crossed premiership in 2006, 2007. And there had been, I think, during that stretch, during that interim, a profound sense that Japan's voice was missing, that because it didn't have steady leadership, because the prime ministers were changing, the cabinets were changing, this coincided, of course, with the global financial crisis, and I think a strategic shift in China at the same time, and then questions about US leadership at the same time. There was a real sense, I think, that there was a need for Japan to speak up more and to be more visible and to contribute more, and it did not have the leadership to do that. And of course, what you had for Abe comes back in 2012, and I think many of us were surprised first by his comeback and then by his durability. But what you ended up having was a prime minister who really had, I think, a durable domestic political mandate, and we can I probably don't have time really to go into the reasons for that, but he continued to win elections. He continued to enjoy strong public approval, and with that, he was really able to survive and really articulate a direction for Japan in the world and Japan in the region. And this really started from the first weeks after taking office. He goes to, his first foreign trip was to Southeast Asia, just like Prime Minister Suga has done now. In January of 2013, he gives a speech in Jakarta. And it really set the tone, I think, for the duration of his tenure, where he really stressed the importance of Southeast Asia as a focus of Japan's foreign policy, a recognition essentially that the competition with China, it wasn't just about China as a military power or China as a direct threat to Japan, but it really was a contest for political and economic influence in the kind of growing middle income countries of Asia, and that Japan had a role to play ensuring that they had economic, political independence, and also an ability to counter China's attempts to change the status quo in the South China Sea. And Japan, from the beginning of Abe's tenure, would play a role on all of those fronts, that Japan would be a partner economically, that it would provide increasing amounts of military assistance and military capacity building in the South China Sea. And that approach, I mean, and it consistently refined that approach, but really the themes from the beginning had been present. What you also got, I think, with a stable government was a government that was capable of pursuing reforms to how Japan made foreign policy. And that was something that those reforms were basically achieved during Abe's first year in office. By the end of his first year, you had a National Security Council Secretariat, you had a national security strategy, you basically had the makings of Conte-led, prime minister-led foreign policy making. And so that you had a stable prime minister, a prime minister who looked likely to survive. And then that prime minister had the tools to follow through on the kind of things he said he wanted to do, and to really make policy change stick. And so just year after year, using the power of the prime ministership to make the kind of changes that Abe felt Japan needed. The other area where I think you really saw appreciable change was in the relationship with the United States. And we can really look at the arc of Abe's tenure dealing with two very different US presidents. It's sort of kind of an overarching theme where you saw, I think, during the first years, a tremendous amount of creativity, despite, I think, President Obama and Prime Minister Abe maybe not having quite the same personal relationship as we would see in later years with President Trump. But both on the economic side, where you had a commitment from both administrations to getting the Trans-Pacific Partnership done, and as part of that, a bilateral trade agreement that overcame some of the longstanding trade issues between the United States and Japan. And then also, I think, on Abe's part, really committing to allowing Japan to do more within the context of the alliance. So you had a commitment in 2014 to reinterpret the Constitution, and then changing Japan's national security laws to enable the self-defense forces to fulfill those roles. And again, you had a prime minister, because he had as much domestic political strength, that he could run these, what for another prime minister, maybe a shorter-lived prime minister, would be an unthinkable political risk. Abe was strong enough to invest significant political capital in actually getting both of those initiatives across the finish line. Maybe a little less creativity after the Trump administration, where it seemed more about defending what had been achieved from a leader who maybe had some unorthodox or heterodox ideas about U.S. alliances. But nevertheless, I mean, I think a real commitment on Abe's part to using the power that he had accumulated to rack up foreign policy achievements. I think I'm coming to the end of my 5 minutes, but hopefully I've set the tone and teed up my fellow panelists, to carry this discussion forward.
Tobias, thank you very much. A very swift survey of what the Prime Minister has achieved. I'm sure we'll want to come back to that and interrogate what is a fairly positive assessment, I think. And my role when I ask questions will probably be to be as challenging as possible, although I sympathize with very much of what you've said, actually. But let's leave that to one side and move on swiftly to Saudi.
Thank you. First of all, I hope my noise outside doesn't bother you too much, but I am honored to be on this panel with all these primary wonderful experts of Japan and Asia Pacific. To be on the same Zoom page with all of you is a great honor. So I would like to use my 5 minutes to talk about the fact that how Abe, Prime Minister Abe, put Japan on the regional and global leader, Japan as a regional and global leader, and put them on the map. So, various things that already John mentioned about the Indo-Pacific, the TPP, CPTPP, as well as RCEP, and also the G20 principle of quality infrastructure investment. All those are significant achievement on the part of Japan. And since my book covers mostly on the political economy side of the picture, I would like to emphasize that part. I would like to argue that I've been arguing that there are two aspects that Japan has been doing quite significantly well in this context in the last 8 years under Abe. On the one side, this is a kind of a global picture or regional dynamics that's going on, which is basically the way in which US-China's competition has intensified over the course of this time. And in that competition, especially in the context of rule setting in the region, economic rule setting in the region, Japan is playing what I would call a pivotal role in it. This is a way in which by putting Japan's weight on the kind of the ideal rules for the region, this will really create a diffusion effect in promoting and making this these rules set within that regional context. So in that case, Japan really kind of gained a significant weight and prominence in this overall competition between US and China. And as Japan being the matured economy within the context of East Asia, where Japan used to be, kind of a protectionist, mercantilist, all the entity that China is being at this point, while during the time of the trade war, trade competition with the United States in the 1980s, even into the early 1990s. Well, Japan's domestic economy, as well as business, the big businesses which are competitive in many ways, have kind of gotten over that type of protectionist kind of environment where they were relying on the interventionist government policy to get themselves out there in the global competition. Now what they want is to have good rules where they can be an effective investor, being protected by these rules, and be the global player. So that in many ways, Japan's past and what Japan is now is the kind of what do you call it, the model for the other East Asian economies, and it's setting the trajectory in that way. So overall, this is the kind of way in which the global regional economic context, the way in which Japan has become a prominent player in this rule-setting game. Obviously, US-China decoupling is a concern, but now Japan uses various institutions like the Indo-Pacific Quad on one side, TPP and on the other, to engage US through the institutional means. And in some ways, the election of, hopefully concluded election of President Biden will make that strategy more effective because US is willing to engage in these institutional kind of participation within the Asia Pacific. The second side is the domestic side. So this is the kind of what I call the kind of domestic global nexus. The Prime Minister Abe actually played this TPP game and engaged, again, once he got elected for the second term in December, by March, he clearly announced that Japan is going to participate in TPP. As people who are watching Japan knew that there were so many oppositions against TPP, and Abe turned it around and managed to participate as the 12th and last member of the TPP negotiation. And in some ways, it was really important for Japan to do that, not only because of the kind of external facing kind of leadership position that Japan wants to take, but also the domestic reform. So this is the major component of the third era of the Abenomics. And Japan was, was trying to use the proverbial gaiatsu, the foreign pressure, to help the reform moving forward. Even though this probably didn't pan out as well as it Abe wanted, because the US decided not to participate, but this was one kind of trigger really that connects a domestic mandate to the international kind of strategy for Japan. Meanwhile, overall, the big businesses, as I mentioned, they are already matured, competitive. They are the investors rather than just the exporters, and they want the rules within the region to be set up in such a way that they be protected, from kind of intellectual property rights to e-commerce and many other things that was that's been included in CPTPP. So overall, this is what the Abe has achieved. And in many ways, I totally agree with Tobias in the sense that Abe was very skilled in creating a very stable domestic environment, and not only political environment, but I would say institutional environment that Abe used to kind of overcome many of the bureaucratic fragmentation of the policymaking, and created strategic kind of a secretariat under Kante, the Prime Minister's office, to make many of the proactive initiatives kind of rolled out and being implemented very effectively. So overall, I know this is the overall. I will end with saying that Prime Minister Suga actually inherited that institution, and I think he will stay the course. Again, how effectively is to be seen. But I think Japan is both in terms of regionally, globally, as well as domestically situated to keep the course in the way that Abe kind of put forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sari, and thank you for bringing in the political economy dimension. I think it complements Tobias's presentation really nicely. Let's zoom out a bit now and move to our last speaker, Misha Oslin, whose work in a sense looks at the region as a whole, and of course will be able, from his vantage point, to talk about the role of the United States also and the bilateral alliance. Misha, over to you.
John, thank you, and thank you to my my co-panelists. They set it up brilliantly, and there's really not a lot to say. So let me then take the other side of the argument, which is to question the presumption of the panel. Or the title of the panel, which is Japan's leadership in Asia, and to question just how much leadership Japan has in Asia. Again, this is how would I put it? This is an analytical approach. It's certainly not, it's not to say that's my own personal preference, but if we were talking about this before Abe resigned, then I could ask the same question. Obviously, in light of his resignation, it becomes somewhat a referendum, so to speak, on Abe's leadership and an overall assessment of what he accomplished. And I think we have to ask, in terms of the broader geopolitics of the region, not the specifics that Tobias so carefully laid out, or some of the deeper structural issues that Saori talked to us about, but in terms of the geopolitics, and I would also say in terms of the perceptions in the region, how much did Abe change anything? Or even more starkly, did he actually change anything? I think if you asked most people, probably globally, if not in the region, about the question of leadership in the Indo-Pacific or the question of leadership in Asia, most people would probably answer that it's China that is the leader of the Indo-Pacific today. It's China that increasingly sets if not the rules, because it's working within a broader traditional set of norms and rules that, of course, we understand the contestation of that between Beijing and Washington in the West, but it's the one that certainly seems to set many of the long-term goals. We can think of the One Belt, One Road, for example, as a very comprehensive geoeconomic and geostrategic approach to change the geopolitical conditions inside of Asia. If we look at the security angle, despite all that Prime Minister Abe achieved, and actually stretching back to before he became Prime Minister under Prime Minister Noda as well, some of the modernization of the SDF, the self-defense forces, I think the majority of opinion would come down on the side of China being the truly important security player in Asia. That sets aside the United States as an outside power playing a role, but if you look at Asian powers themselves, the idea would probably be more accepted that it's China, which is actually determinant of security arrangements, security relations, stability or the lack thereof. Obviously, the CPTPP as a second best endpoint of a longer process, meaning the TPP, the original TPP itself, as I mentioned, nonetheless would be countered by questions about its overall effectiveness, its overall reach in the light of the One Belt and One Road and other broader Pan-Asian trade proposals that have been put out by China and other countries in the region. Politically, the question of whether Japan really has become a major leader in the East Asia Summit or ASEAN processes or APEC, the degree to which anyone can, outside of ASEAN, can become a leader in ASEAN processes. Whether or not it is seen that these political organizations are actually responding largely to China, as opposed to initiatives that Tokyo has put out. The fundamental question is one of, if we want to go back to the question of leadership, I guess is then of leadership models, Beijing versus Tokyo, and whether or not what Tokyo has proposed and come up with over the past 8 years or decade or whatever time frame you want to put on it, is one, first of all, that has credibility, that it is a grouping of sovereign, independent, equal nations that come together to try to answer questions about stability and prosperity in the region, upholding, if not increasingly setting norms. First of all, whether that's credible. Secondly, whether it has actually made a difference. Or, on the other side of the ledger, whether this is really all, in some ways, either one of two options. One, still a major competition between Washington and Beijing, between the United States and China, or really that it is simply done in light of the shadow of China's preferences, or one might even put it at the sufferance of Beijing, that it is Beijing really determining the degree to which things like freedom of navigation are still functional concepts, if I can put it that way, meaning that at different points and at different geographic locations, China could change the way that relations are played out. So let me then finish up, having thrown that out on the table, being sort of to be a little counterintuitive to the questions that were asked here. Let me then look at some of the geopolitical cards that Japan has and that Prime Minister Abe played, and then we hope that Prime Minister Suga will continue to play. The first one is India and the strong relationship with India that Tokyo developed, that by its nature is a geographic political relationship. That Beijing has to be very concerned about looking both west and east in terms of a growing condominium between New Delhi and Tokyo, and very successful on the part of Prime Minister Abe to develop that. Whether or not Prime Minister Suga will feel the same and will continue to do it, I think will be very significant in the region. Secondly, Australia. And obviously, when I talk about Australia and India, then automatically we move into the question of the Quad. So you can sort of put that in parentheses, but the question of Australia, very close politically, but also in many ways, and I would argue possibly with India as well, driven less by what Tokyo has done than by what Beijing has done. Meaning Canberra has found itself pushed closer to Tokyo, not because it necessarily feels that Tokyo has a stunningly attractive geopolitical program for the region, but because it's worried about Beijing. Nonetheless, that is a real relationship, and one that, again, forces China to look north to south, just as China must look east to west when dealing with Japan and India. Third, I'll only mention two more. Third, Southeast Asia. A great deal of effort on the part of Prime Minister Abe to create security cooperation. I wouldn't say partnerships necessarily, but cooperation to show that Japan wanted to be and would be involved in the region, to increase presence in the South China Sea, but not to go so far as to make it a clear challenge to China in the way that the United States talks about freedom of navigation operations, and yet building those relationships carefully. And then finally, of course, the United States, the ultimate strategic card for Japan to play. I would actually argue under the Trump administration, while personal relationships were very close between the United States and China, we saw less on the policy side until the very end with the revitalization of the Quad. And I'll leave it with the question of the Quad. Wither the Quad. Can it be what Prime Minister Abe wanted it to be a decade and a half ago? Can it be what the United States has often talked about? Will it become the functional basis of a community, a geopolitical community that actually acts in ways to maintain and uphold security and stability, and then bleeds over into larger questions of how to counter the One Belt and One Road to offer a geoeconomic alternative. So with those questions, I'll turn it back to you, John. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Misha, and thanks for being an agent provocateur, in effect, challenging our two earlier speakers. Let me, while we wait for questions from the audience, ask each of you a couple of questions. And feel free in your responses to engage with not only the questions I pitched to you, but also those to your colleagues. Starting with Tobias, you set out a very persuasive argument that stability has helped Mr. Abe develop, in his own words, a very proactive foreign policy. To what extent do you think that elite commitment we see from him and some of his predecessors, as Misha mentioned, resonates with ordinary Japanese public opinion? Is there an appetite on the part of the Japanese electorate to really engage and support these initiatives? Because we've often heard that elections are very much a function of economic issues rather than foreign policy. So is there a danger that Mr. Abe's actual success in foreign policy doesn't actually bring the country with him? And linked to that question, we saw towards the end of his tenure as Prime Minister, a lot of questions about, for want of a better term, corruption. And is there a danger that stability actually builds complacency and creates legitimacy issues in terms of domestic politics? For Saudi, in terms of political economy, and Misha mentioned this question of how much impact Japan has had in building these regional institutions, and also the question of India. We have with RCEP, for example, an initiative where the Indians have decided not to join, despite frustration on the part of Tokyo. What, if anything, can Tokyo do to support RCEP? Is it still important now that there's talk of a Biden administration seeking to rejoin TPP? And in terms of economic diplomacy, where does trilateralism, and I'm thinking here of trilateralism between Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing stand? The next conference is going to take place under South Korea's auspices. What can the Japanese expect to get out of that particular institutional framework? And finally, for Misha, on the question of China, if China is kind of making the weather in terms of geopolitics and maybe even rules, how do we interpret what appear to be real divisions within the LDP at present? We have people like Toshido Nikai, the Secretary General of the LDP, saying privately that the importance of the China-Japan economic relationship is undiminished. There's a lot of pressure for a visit by Xi Jinping this year, and yet we have the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary, Naoki Okada, representing younger members of the LDP who are quite opposed, apparently, to that visit by Xi, and are much more animated by issues of strategic concern, territorial issues over the Senkakus. Are we seeing a split emerging within the ranks of the LDP? We haven't talked about the question of Taiwan and black swan events of a geostrategic nature that might intrude, that might complicate difficult strategic decisions for a Suga administration if there were to be a rise in conflict. So some questions for all three of you, and while you're mulling over those and giving us your responses, I'll have a look at our questions from the audience. But starting with Tobias.
Sure. I mean, I think it's always hard to get a read on what exactly the Japanese public thinks on foreign policy issues. I mean, I know there are a number of surveys. You can always point to opinions about different countries and different leaders and fears and hopes. Clearly, Abe's mandate did not necessarily rest specifically on the planks of his foreign policy agenda. I mean, I think we can say that pretty confidently. I mean, I think. But there are, I think, a few things that we can say that the public sort of expects in a broad sense. I mean, I think for starting with getting the relationship with the United States right, and the cost to a Japanese prime minister for not doing that, it can be severe. And I think it explains precisely how Prime Minister Abe approached President Trump. I mean, I think explains the gambling on that early visit to New York within a week of Trump becoming the president-elect in 2016, the Gulf games, the real investment in personal diplomacy. I mean, I think there's an expectation that there is a domestic price to be paid, if it looks like the U.S. relationship has been mishandled. I mean, just ask former Prime Minister Hatoyama about what the price that could be paid for doing that. And so, I mean, I think there's definitely a negative side to it. I do also suspect, I mean, it's hard to really find opinion polls that really would give you, no one is asking this question outright. But I got the sense, certainly, that from 2016 onward, that when you looked at Prime Minister Abe's approval ratings, that it was partly driven by a sense that, that the world was, increasingly unstable, that there was a need to have a leader who was experienced and capable in power. And I think it explained why the public actually was willing to forgive actually a lot of those scandals that you mentioned, that even though the level of trust in Abe's explanations were abysmal. I mean, something like 80% of people said that Abe wasn't really being forthright about any of the scandals he faced from 2017 onward. It wasn't really until this year and the perception that he had mishandled the pandemic that his approval ratings really fell sharply below 50% for a sustained stretch of time. And so I think the fact that his numbers held up as well as they did from 2017 onward really reflected kind of a general public unease about the world outside. It wasn't necessarily, again, there's nothing that said specifically, how do you rank that, do you feel, anxious about the world and do you support Abe for that reason? It was never quite that black and white. But I think, just sort of connecting the dots, that you could say that really was a strong factor in Abe's durability as his tenure lengthened. To the second point, I mean, I think it's an excellent point. And there is absolutely the risk that, now that Japan has moved from during the first decade of this century, where you had kind of a nascent two-party system, some pretty vibrant political competition and big vote swings from election to election, high voter turnout, you are now in a period of the one strong, many weak party system. The LDP really does not have any competition. You had extremely low voter turnout in election after election, which was a major factor in Abe's ability to win those elections over and over again. I mean, and there is a danger, that you're going to have complacent government, that you're not going to have quite creative leadership or just kind of pushback on whether ideas are good ones. I mean, Abe in some ways is the best example of that. I mean, his comeback, had the LDP not been in opposition, it's hard to see Abe coming back. He really was able to present a pointed critique of the DBJ government, offered a different economic policy agenda from his rivals within the LDP. I mean, really was able to differentiate himself, and the LDP needed to do that. And so his recovery was a testament to the need for that kind of political competition, which Japan does not have right now. So, I mean, certainly at this moment, I mean, it's hard to say that Japan's democracy is in a particularly healthy state. That you're not seeing the kind of vibrant political competition. You're not really having the kind of debates over what should our relationship with China be in this time. You're getting sort of intra LDP debates, as you mentioned, but not really sort of an open discussion about what really is sort of the biggest question that Japan is going to face for years to come. And that really should be something that you have multiple voices and multiple parties talking about that you don't have right now. And there's not really any reason to think that the election that we're expecting to see next year is going to give a different result than we've seen in the last few general elections. So I'll stop there and hand it over to the next panel.
And a point which I think we should come back to, your point about kind of the health of democracy. It's interesting, isn't it? The readout from the conversations, the first calls between Biden and both, the South Korean, the Australian, the Japanese leaders all highlight the importance of democracy. And I think that's a really striking focus. And it'd be interesting to see whether America's allies are willing to pick up that baton if Biden decides to prioritize that in his administration. But let's move on to Saori. Quick thoughts on
yeah,
those.
Thank you. And if I may, I want to restructure your question and say two things, right? So one is on the RCEP and India and other institutions. So basically, to me, yes, it was really disappointing for Japan that India decided not to kind of pursue RCEP, and I think it's going to be signed in the next few days. So RCEP is going to be established soon without India in it. I know Japan will pursue many other avenues with India, and that's very important, and I agree with Misha on that. While RCEP is still very relevant because this is the first FTA with Japan between Japan and China and Japan and South Korea. So in many ways, this is really going to be another institution that Japan will kind of put their weight about the rule setting and other things important for Japanese economy overall. On the other hand, CPTPP is going to, well, hopefully this will expand. UK might be part of it. Obviously Thailand is, Colombia and various others. So again, Japan will use these institutions to really reach out and create more of the weight on these policy making. So that's one. The second part is about Japan's relationship with China as well as South Korea, and obviously kind of beyond talking about the trilateralism, trilateral meetings, just kind of responding to Misha's point too, that the fact that China's leadership is much more prominent and heavy and kind of strong and visible and all that doesn't mean that Japan's leadership is declining. I don't think it's a zero-sum game between these two. In some ways, Japan gets pulled in if China is not dominant and aggressive and then this and that. So that's one side. At the same time, I think Misha yourself kind of wrote about cooperative competition, where Japan and China learns from Japan too. And there are many things that they are collaborating, especially under Trump, but even beyond that. There are many commonalities and kind of ways in which they see a kind of a similar trajectory of developing countries achieving to the advanced level and then so on and so forth. So that's one side. About South Korea is much more difficult now. And especially now Biden coming in place, this relationship between Japan and South Korea will be one of the priorities for the US administration looking at Japan in the kind of a regional politics. And I think, I would not kind of really guess exactly where it's going to go, but the relationship has to improve one way or the other. And, it's an important kind of a key in the regional structure. So I'll stop.
Thanks, Sari. And just a quick note to our audience. I can see that one participant, Jason James, has his raise hand function. We're not using that, so if you do have a question, please use the Q&A function to ask your question, Jason, and then we'll take it from there. Misha.
Thank you. Great questions. Sari's last point is a really crucial one on which way the Biden administration is going to go. North Korea is going to impact the trilateral US, Japan, South Korea relationship. What the Moon administration in South Korea will feel about how far they can bring the Biden administration back in, whether they will want to recreate the strategic patience of the Obama administration. There's a lot of important questions there that I think will directly get to the question of how Tokyo and Seoul will be acting together, certainly under within the framework of Washington. But John, I will answer your question. First of all, I don't think it's different from any other country, which what I mean by that is that there are always cross-cutting and competing ideas in any major country dealing with China about security versus economics, about cultural issues versus politics, and so on and so forth. I mean, the significant element of the Trump administration's China policy was to begin fleshing out, and I actually think they did quite a bit of this, fleshing out what I call the great fusion in United States domestic politics over the China question, meaning criticisms on the left over free trade issues, for example, or human rights issues, criticisms on the right over security issues, technology issues, and obviously, the military competition. All of those fused together. We saw it in 2016. We saw that Hillary Clinton said she was going to pull out of the TPP. She had advisors that were talking about taking a much tougher line on China than the Obama administration had. So regardless of who became president 4 years ago, we would have had some type of reckoning with China. The particular path that Trump took, will be judged by historians. I think it's a policy of primarily putting reciprocity at the core of the relationship. It's not that different from other countries, including Japan. You asked about the LDP divisions. This goes back in Japanese history to the 1970s and the normalization of relations between Japan and China under Prime Minister Tanaka. You had, parliamentarians like Ozawa who questioned, how far Japan should be getting close to China. It's always been a balancing between the security elements and the economic elements, and that again is what every major country has faced. I don't think it's necessarily. And by the way, you also asked interestingly about younger LDP parliamentarians taking perhaps a more security-related view. I mean, I remember a decade ago when we were talking about then younger LDP parliamentarians doing the exact same thing, talking about, starting to raise the alarm about the senkakus and things like that. So in some ways, it's, plus ça change, it's everything just comes around. But I think that's, that is the political debate that needs to be had. The question of a prudential response to security challenges has to be balanced with a prudential understanding of the benefits for an economy of dealing with China. For Japan, I would just mention, because Taiwan came up, I think it should come up more. I mean, this is really an existential question for Japan in many ways. It will directly reflect credibility on the US alliance, not that the US has a defense alliance with Taiwan like it has with Japan. But the question of whether the Biden administration continues the type of support for Japan that we've seen under the Trump administration, whether then Beijing feels it has an opening to try to further isolate Tsai Ing-wen and blunt her policies, this will be crucial to Tokyo's perception of its own geostrategic space in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Misha. Let me turn now to questions from the audience. We have a question from James Hardy at the Foreign Commonwealth Office, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as it's now known. James would like to ask all of you about Abe's policy towards South Korea. What could or should he have done differently? Let's start with Tobias. So the assumption, I presume, is that relations, it's no secret, between Seoul and Tokyo are pretty much at a low ebb at the moment, although there has been some effort to start a dialogue. But Tobias, where would you put that in Abe's kind of success sheet? How would you grade bilateral relations under Mr. Abe, and to what extent is Japan itself responsible for the parlous state of affairs?
I mean, I feel like we could probably spend the remainder of our time talking about South Korea. I mean, there's obviously a lot there. I mean, it's when you look at the whole path. I mean, the real place where I think Abe maybe is to blame is, in the early part of his tenure, he was clearly willing to work with the PAC administration. You had what I thought at the time was certainly a significant agreement in 2015 on the comfort women, where Abe was willing to go much further in making an apology and providing restitution than I had thought that he was capable of. And I remember co-writing something at the time warning that if South Korea were to back away from it, that they shouldn't assume that subsequent Japanese leaders would be as willing to make an agreement, particularly if the Japanese government felt that South Koreans couldn't be trusted after pulling out of an agreement like that. And unfortunately, I think that's exactly what's happened. Where I think now the position in Tokyo, particularly under now a progressive government, is that it's a progressive government that not only basically scrapped the 2015 agreement, but has been pretty open about having problems with the 1965 Basic Treaty. Now, there are reasons. I mean, it's understandable why you have an administration that has its questions about that treaty. You can also understand why they feel like they can't intervene in these court cases, and that you have separation of powers, and it's not the place of a government to do that. But so you understand both positions, and I think where Abe was at fault was that when you did have the transition to a different type of Korean government, I think there was a sense of hostility, that they sort of immediately took a defensive crouch. As these court cases popped up, immediately I think escalated and really sought basically total victory. They wanted South Korea to give up entirely, which I don't think was a domestically, was just politically sustainable for a Korean leader with Moon's constituencies. And so, I mean, it's just that it was kind of ramping up and escalating, knowing that you were going to wind up in the situation where relations are spiraling downwards and there's not really any way out right now. And for all the talks that are going on at the moment, I mean, this week we've seen some activity. There's not a lot of optimism for backing away from that. And so I think immediately taking that approach to a different kind of Korean government, I think was a mistake, and not trying to see if there was maybe a way forward despite the change of government. But I mean, there's plenty of blame to go around. I mean, this is not solely Abe's fault.
Okay, Saori and Misha, do you agree? Do you have your other thoughts on this question, the bilateral relationship between Tokyo and Seoul?
I know this is such a difficult issue. I have kind of optimistic kind of reading and the pessimistic reading of it. The pessimistic side is this is kind of a partly structural issue where Cold War kind of compromise that Korea, South Korea, and Japan made has been now kind of dismantling 1965 and everything else, and also securitization of economic relationship is really kind of a difficult thing, and I really worry about this relationship. On the other hand, kind of an optimistic side is this, the understanding, the civilian, the kind of people to people understanding has expanding quite significantly between Korea and Japan. Obviously K-pop to, all those exchanges and young people kind of going back and forth, all that, hopefully would increase the understanding between two countries. But again, overall, these tit for tat and kind of the dynamics is very difficult. And there is a North Korea issue element there too. That's
okay. Thank you. Misha, just on the same point, but looking at it from the vantage point of the USA, there's talk of Antony Blinken being the new national security advisor. I don't know if that's credible, but his past experiences involved a lot of coordination between Seoul, Tokyo, and DC. Are the Americans going to be the great kind of, if not mediator, are they going to knock heads together and get their two allies to bury the hatchet, whether it's historical or personal?
John, you literally anticipated what I was going to say and bring up. First, I was going to say James always asks the hard questions, so I'm not surprised we're struggling with this. Yeah, I was actually literally going to say that, and more in the sense of being the mini bomb thrower of this session, which is first, I think Tobias is right in the larger sense of it's disappointing that we didn't see more mature diplomacy or more sophisticated diplomacy on all sides. But within that, I want to blame Washington. And this goes long before the Trump administration, predates the Obama administration. It's very disappointing to me that Washington didn't do what you said, maybe in a slightly more artful way, but is to bang heads. At least, in order to do it right, you have to get both of the other parties to want to have their heads banged, right? They have to feel like this is a good thing that I'm having my head banged by them, because that's the only way to ultimately get them to agree. But I think Washington has also been remiss. I mean, we're in this dull period of a very timid diplomacy, as opposed to really either, first of all, and I would fully support it, completely behind the scenes so that none of us knew what was going on, banging heads together, or something that was really bold, that really did put it in a very broad geopolitical framework as to why Tokyo and Seoul had to and still have to get together. But we're even farther away from that today than we were, let's say, circa 2015, 2014, as Tobias pointed out.
Great, thank you. Two economic questions. One from Neil Brown, who asks, how will Japan play CPTPP and RCEP simultaneously? Are there common aims behind those two initiatives? Which I guess is a question of what do they both deliver in terms of Japan's interests, and how important are they in terms of regional integration? We've touched on it with the question of India. And a second question from Robert Moore, who thanks the panel for their views and says, may I ask the panel whether Japan sees the Belt and Road policy as a particular challenge to its future, which brings us back again to the question of Sino-Japanese relations, and thinking back to Abe's visit back in 2018 to Beijing, where of course there was a very comprehensive set of economic agreements. It'd be interesting to know, Japan has flirted with this idea of being a more active player, but how much more active? Can we start with Saori, since this is, I think, eminently your domain?
I'll take the RCEP CPTPP question. So obviously Japan really was fortunate for Japan to be able to do CPTPP prior to RCEP agreement. RCEP is much looser, not as high standard agreement, because many of the members are not advanced economies. It's not the can-do agreement like the CPP is. So in some ways, Japan kind of bridged some parts of it, but many of the behind the border, kind of issues like, again, the intellectual property rights or e-commerce, so on, many of that are not part of RCEP. It's much more the kind of lowering the tariff across the border. So in some ways, Japan being able to kind of bridge some of that element that CPTPP has in negotiation with RCEP was, something that it did throughout the process. But since the RCEP is not as rule-based, kind of as rule-making entity as the CPTPP is, in some ways that CPTPP's rule is the kind of gold standard that would kind of be used for the members which can actually do this type of agreement. I think that another challenge actually for Japan in bridging the gap, bridging the difference is rather CPTPP and the Japan EU, because they have kind of a high standard rules, and then some of them, kind of the digital economy and a few other parts are not consistent with each other. I really have to, I have to go to the international lawyers to kind of figure out, I guess Japan has to go to the international lawyers to kind of figure out, what are the, how to make these either consistent or compromise, but that's the kind of challenge of overall. So that's where Japan stands in that.
Okay, great, thank you. Misha, Thelton Road, Sino-Japan cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, Belt and Road should be seen as a very sophisticated, regardless of how well it is actually executed, but a very sophisticated geostrategy of linking, and it's we think of it as continental. It's land-based. It's also the maritime Silk Road, so it's maritime-based. We always think of it as east-west. It's also north-south, reaching up into Russia, actually reaching to polar regions. It's extremely comprehensive, and it needs to be understood in a broad context of linking up with long-standing security goals of the PRC. Related to access through the Indian Ocean, access through Eurasia into energy-producing regions, ultimately access for, I think, not only for economics, but for political reasons, directly into Europe, so that you're essentially creating the tendons of an integrated system. It's one reason, by the way, why, even though it's still called One Belt, One Road in Chinese, in English, they prefer to call it the Belt and Road, to sort of take away a little bit of the sting of the idea that all of this ultimately centers back on China, on Beijing. It's hierarchical as opposed to what we like to think of international agreements and things that already talked about, which are horizontal. This is actually really hierarchical in many ways. And so I wouldn't say it's existential for Japan, but it's extremely significant, as it should be for the US. Now, one thing that the US has come up with as an alternative is something called the Blue Dot Network. Sounds a little sort of new agey, the new blue dots that are going to be populating the map, but it is a way to try to get, again, to what's already just mentioned, high-level agreements and high-level understandings of what trade, infrastructure, environmental protections, labor protections, and the like should be in these broader economic agreements between countries. So Japan, I think, and Tokyo should be taking full advantage of alternatives. That said, there's been a lot of work that's shown that actually what Japan is doing with its very long-standing ODA efforts with the Asian Development Bank has actually been more successful than the One Belt, One Road, that it has still given more money. It has still had better quality agreements. It has completed those agreements or completed those contracts of whether building infrastructure or the like. Hard for Americans to remember that America does not play the infrastructure game globally. It's really, and when we're talking about Asia or the Indo-Pacific, it's really Japan and China. So Japan very involved in Southeast Asia, in the Mekong River Valley, very involved in India. These are areas where I think Japan does have a leadership role that it should be continuing, and continuing successfully, so that we don't always buy into the hype of the One Belt, One Road. And yet all of that still takes place within the context of a Sino-Japanese economic relationship that, even with some level of decoupling, is critical to both countries and will remain so.
And a very useful reminder, isn't it, that national leadership may be changing, that we may be actually, the types of strengths that countries have may be different from those that the United States used as a basis for its past leadership role. we have one final question which allows us very conveniently to circle back to the question of personal leadership, where we started with Tobias. And Jason James asks that it appears to him that political longevity is partly what is important, but also that the Japanese prime ministers who make a difference are the most colorful ones. And he's thinking of Nakasone, Koizumi, and Abe. He asks, does Suga have the personality, or indeed the English language competence, to forge real relationships with overseas leaders in the way that Abe has done? And I will add my rider to this question, which is that, we started with this Mr. Abe's durability. How long is Prime Minister Suga likely to last? I'm going to ask all of you, each of you, to stick your necks out and entertain this question. Are we facing a possible snap election in early 2021? Or is Mr. Suga likely to wait until after the Olympics? And does he have the capacity to challenge Abe's leadership as the longest serving post-war prime minister? So let's start with Tobias.
So a few questions bundled there. I would say that, this question of whether a colorful prime minister makes a successful prime minister. I don't know if we actually have just enough numbers to deal with. And I think you have different models of what makes for successful prime ministers, and what Suga I think is going to bring, and something that he differs from Abe, being a sort of self-made politician, not being a hereditary politician. He is someone who is tremendously detail-oriented. He is not, very different, in different ways from both Koizumi and Abe, who were, sort of big picture. We're going to point in this direction, and I'm gonna lead the way, but leave it to some other people maybe to fill in some of the details. Suga is someone who very much knows the details, but also because of his his background as a self-made non-hereditary politician, I think has a clearer sense of maybe what the public wants, and really keeping sort of improving livelihoods. So I'm actually relatively bullish on his survival prospects. I would give him about 4 years. I think he leads the LDP to a victory next year. I expect that. My guess is that we'll see an election probably in April of 2021, after the budget passes and sort of before the real run up to the Olympics next year. And assuming that if they can roll out a vaccine, or at least start rolling out a vaccine, I think that was the implication of Suga's remark earlier this fall. And so I suspect he leads the LDP to an electoral victory. It looks very similar to the last couple of elections. He wins another term as LDP leader in September of 2021, and basically manages to serve out a term. He's not going to challenge Abe's record. I think, he's older. You have younger LDP politicians in the waiting. And I think he will eventually step aside at that point. But I'd give him 4 years. I'm bullish.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, same question, but
So,
I'm going to throw in one final question from the floor. Dominic.
Okay, I'll focus on the Suga's foreign policy, kind of, especially Japan, China. So the kingmaker for Suga is Mr. Nikai, who is the old-timer LDP politician who has a very strong channel to China. And I think that will serve Prime Minister Suga well in kind of connecting to China, understanding China, maybe a bit more of the kind of a cooperation, and more even under Biden, not under Trump. And also, I would like to say that Suga has been the head of the cabinet secretariat for the entire duration under Abe. Obviously that's behind the scene kind of an element, but that's where all these TPP headquarters is, and all these policies are made. And he was, I think, behind this infrastructure initiatives too. So in many ways, he does have a maybe very low profile, but quite a bit of expertise in foreign policy. So in that sense, I think he would be quite effective in that area. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Sari. Misha, if you can also tackle the following question from Dominic Chalou-Lavoie, if I pronounced that correctly, from Montreal University, who asks about the impact of Abe on immigration policy, but also, given that we're talking about Mr. Suga's popularity, and he's also been associated with immigration, is he likely to pick up that potentially problematic policy issue, and will it be his making in terms of his longevity?
So on all these domestic politics questions, I will happily defer to Tobias and Saori. On immigration, I think it is inevitable, it was inevitable that Japan would eventually have to grasp the nettle of some level of a liberalized immigration scheme, but very, very moderated, and done so in a way that the results can be seen carefully, and therefore there would be a very rational discussion about whether to take further steps, i.e. open up more slots beyond the, what is it, the several, I think it's 365,000, something like that, that were initially let in, how you maintain it more like a Canadian system rather than the American system, meaning it's based on skills and abilities to add on to the economy and the like. I don't know. I think, it's nothing I would expect to be a barn burning issue right away. It's, this has just been introduced, so we'll have to see how it develops. Interesting that the questioner, the prior questioner, indicated Nakasone was colorful. I don't know if many people would say he was colorful, powerful, very clear and strategic sighted, colorful. Let me again answer it from a different perspective than how Tobias and Saori answered it, which is, how will Suga respond to challenges that he faces that are exogenous to Japan, meaning, coming in from particularly China and North Korea. We haven't talked about North Korea in this hour, much about it at all. One thing we know is that North Korea challenges every new leader. They challenge every new president with something. They try, it's been a long time since they've had to try to challenge a Japanese leader, 8 years, but that's the first thing I would expect. The clock is running, I would say, within the quarter, meaning through, if something hasn't happened by February or March of next year, I would say that Kim Jong-un has lost his mojo, or maybe more, because we don't know what's going on there, but Japan needs to expect something, whether it's missile launches, whether it's some type of infiltration, we don't know what it is. How does Suga respond to that? That's going to be crucial. Same thing with China, particularly pushing on senkakus in the South China Sea. A little less directly, but looking at things like, for example, Hong Kong, that's a China issue, but it certainly affects Japan. It affects other democracies. Where does Suga come down on these? Does he have a clear policy? Does he articulate Japan's interest? Does he work with foreign leaders? Does he seem like he's taken aback? Does fine, Japan has a National Security Council. Is it effective? Or was this really, Abe had a very clear strategic vision, and therefore when challenges cropped up, the mechanisms that he put into place could come into play to basically support what was very clear Abe ends, versus you can have all the mechanisms you want, and if there's not a clear policy, they're just going to be going at each other crosswise. So, Suga will have to show great leadership when it comes down to issues like this. Questions of Russia as well, and how he responds. What does he try to do with Russia, and how he responds to an increasing Russo-Chinese or Sino-Russian, depending on how you want to put it, condominium in security in East Asia. So my answer to whether he gets 4 years or 6 years or 2 years is really, what are the wild cards that we don't know that are going to change the betting odds in real time? Meaning, what is the crisis that he's not prepared for, that he doesn't show leadership for? And then do you see one of two things happening? Either challenges internally, intra-party from the LDP, some of these young Turks, as you're talking about, coming up and wanting to replace him, or does the party itself begin to lose some of its electoral magic that it's had under Abe? And I know Tobias and I somewhat disagree with that question of electoral magic, but does this give an opening for the Democratic Party or other parties to show that they can handle better what is an increasingly difficult geopolitical environment, and one, let's be honest, in which we don't really know which way the new American administration will go. It could be one that's all talk and no action. It could be one that's all action without any unifying theme. It could be one that's overreacting, underreacting. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty. The two most important powers outside of China in Asia today have new leadership. So we'll have to wait and see how both of them respond to the challenges that we know our adversaries are going to be throwing at us, and how we bring in friends like the UK and others to be part of that solution. Thanks.
Misha, thank you for reminding us with those concluding remarks how precarious the global situation is, and the challenges that any new leader faces. Mr. Suga clearly will have a lot on his plate. and it remains to be seen how you will handle all of those challenges. But I think this has been a really fruitful discussion. I'm sorry we ran over a few minutes, but we did get in all of the questions I think that were raised. I'm very grateful to the three of you for being so succinct and also so illuminating in your presentations and in your remarks. We could keep going. I'm sure there's a lot more to discuss, but this has been a really stimulating exchange. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you to the audience for listening and sharing your questions with us. Just to remind you that this is recorded, it will be uploaded onto the Centre for Geopolitics website shortly, so you can listen again if you wish. But without any further ado, this brings this session to an end, and my thanks to you all. Stay safe wherever you may be, and join us again for future webinars at the Centre for Geopolitics.